the statements that come out of Genesis, for example, that human beings are images of God, totally unique to Genesis. No comparable literature, Babylonian or whatever, comes anywhere near an insight of that kind or an assertion of that kind. The most humane, the greatest invitation to humane awareness of the sacredness of other people that could be imagined. I think it's a very beautiful. One of the reasons that I am utterly and totally devoted to religion is because I can't bear the smallness of the secularized world. I think that radical individualism very quickly becomes very empty and boring.
Yes.
I mean, how many yachts can you have, or how many yachts is it meaningful to have? This sort of thing. This plutocratic class we have generated lately has no imagination, no aesthetic sense. They just keep doing a few little things over and over again. I think that it's becoming very clear how hollow an aspiration that worldview is.
Marilynne Robinson is an American Pulitzer Prize winner as an author and a novelist. She's written many award-winning books, including Gilead, Housekeeping, Home, and Jack. Her latest book is, in fact, a surprising bestseller called Reading Genesis. Marilynne, thank you so much for giving us your time.
My pleasure.
If I can kick off, someone I've heard of recently said that he was closely reading the book of Genesis, and he was struck by a sense that he was reading perhaps the greatest piece of literature that he'd ever come across. What's the appeal of Genesis for you, given that you've written such a bestseller about it and plainly are deeply immersed in it?
Well, I mean, it establishes everything that follows in terms of the Bible itself. And I'm just now beginning to compose a meditation on the prologue to the Gospel of John, which really is a revision of the early passages of Genesis, in the beginning and so on, and the profundity of it, the impact of simply that poem. It just resonates through the whole Bible, and then, of course, the implications that, the statements that come out of Genesis, for example, that human beings are images of God, totally unique to Genesis. No comparable literature, Babylonian or whatever, comes anywhere near an insight of that kind or an assertion of that kind. The most humane, the greatest invitation to humane awareness of the sacredness of other people that could be imagined. I think it's a very beautiful piece of literature, aside from its other importance, and I think that there's been an odd antagonistic relationship to scripture by many of its scholars, and this is since 1850 or so, and that Genesis has been uniquely the victim of this sort of tendentious misinterpretation, the kind of quasi-scholarly JEDP school, that came out of Germany in the middle of the 19th century, and then also the earlier distinction between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, which is completely bizarre, and very much based on misreadings that begin in Genesis. So I just think it's a world historical document of incalculable importance, so I thought, well, I'll write a book about it,
Interestingly, it often strikes me that people, when they think Genesis, they think, creation versus evolution. In reality, there's almost no space at the beginning dedicated to how things began, it moves virtually straight away to setting out, as you've just said, the uniqueness and the importance of each individual, of a loving and engaged creator. It's really not a science book, and doesn't pretend to be in any way, shape, or form.
No, it doesn't. It gives people, a sort of model of the world they knew, flying birds and swimming fish and all the rest of it, as sort of sanctification of what would have been a real portrait of the world from the point of view of early hearers or readers. It's kind of odd. The Darwinist sort of people, they act as if Genesis was a sort of how did the lion get its spots, how did the leopard get its spots, rather, narrative. And in fact, what they were coming up with was precisely that, how the leopard got its spots, And it takes, in a way, the prestige of the original narrative and, sort of takes over can I say, it assumes the character of the narrative is the character of their own pre-scientific imaginations, But anyway, I don't think I'm being very clear about that.
It's only a small aspect, but one thing that's often struck me since it was pointed out to me, the remarkable story of Joseph, who is such an attractive personality, despite him being a bit immodest, I suppose you'd say, in the early stages with his self-important dreams. But he goes on through an extraordinary life, and we see that picture where he is not recognized by his brothers, but he comes into contact with them again. He's been so deeply hurt, so, if you like, impacted by his alienation from them, their rejection of him, that he can't trust them. So he tests them time and time again to see whether they're sincere. I thought that was a brilliantly deep little insight into human nature. And it's those insights that sometimes makes you realize you're reading something here that is deeply profound.
Very true. Just the realism of it, the fact that these people are not demigods, they do not do superhuman things, they're actual, working people standing on earth, experiencing things that human beings experience, I mean, if you consider it over against, say, Homer, which came much later than Genesis, you can see how much the true absolute givenness of the human is assumed in Genesis. The realism of the Bible, is a continuous assurance that God is interested in human beings. You don't have to make myth about it or anything like that. They don't have to be superhuman in order to be fully understood as human. And, the rivalry of brothers and so on. The sadness of Jacob. Oh my goodness. Think of living for years with the idea that your sons may have killed your favorite son, it seems to me as if all that is laid out, so that, again, the Bible makes the brilliant point that Joseph's brothers don't trust him. And the reason they don't is because they have acted so terribly against him, So it's not only the fact of having been hurt, but it's also the fact of having been profoundly guilty that makes people distrust. I think that's very brilliant.
Now, what's interesting about reading Genesis is that it's been a bestseller. It's flown off the shelves. Do you see as that in that some evidence that perhaps America and other Westerners are not quite as secular and perhaps spiritually disinterested as many people think?
Yes, I have actually felt that for quite a long time, just because I can write books on religious subjects and they're very widely accepted, I think that we have let the culture of religion break down to the point where people don't have the language for it anymore. They're not fluent in the languages of prayer and hymn and praise and all these things that are historically associated with it. And, it's as if the secular, the lean cow of secularism has devoured the fat cow of philosophy and all the things that are associated, metaphysics. One of the reasons that I am utterly and totally devoted to religion is because I can't bear the smallness of the secularized world. I love the idea of a neutral space where people meet together on absolutely equal terms. I'm not talking about bringing religion into public life or all these kinds of things that people talk about. I'm talking about making available to people so that they can acquire and school themselves in the language and the beautiful conceptual architecture and so on of Christianity. They have not had that performed for them, I think, in very many cases. And I think one of the reasons that a book like this one would sell well is because people want to know what this essential primary narrative is, how they as human beings can be excluded from what civilizations have built themselves around and talked about over millennia.
Well, certainly, primary narrative is a great term. The Bible's played a massive role in American literature and thought. It's, you think the sermons of the Puritans, you think the spirituals of the African slaves, many of which are still sung in hymns, in churches around the world. The great novels like Moby Dick. The extraordinary influence of even the Old Testament and Exodus on the thinking of some of the founding fathers who shaped your America and their concern, Alexander Hamilton, about the rule of the mob. If you don't break up power, diffuse it, limit the amount of power anybody can obtain and exercise, the time they can keep it, peaceful means for removing those who give way to human failings, pride, hubris, and so forth. You've had this massive influence really on our culture. It's been foundational, and yet today it's decried and not properly appreciated. How has that happened in your view? You must have thought about this.
Well, I think the more that the religion, and it's hard to talk about it. By this I mean the religious culture of individual people, in the sense of individual ministers or rabbis or whoever. They have to teach a very large burden of thought and aesthetic implication and all the rest of it. They have to be immersed in it, and they have to be articulate about it, and they have to assume that they're giving other people something that other people want. When you diminish the vocabulary, the conceptual richness of religion, it comes down to something that can be made into something that compares with, Babylonian mythology or something. Especially if there's an impulse in the society to say, well, anthropology tells us that's all it can be. I think that we're going to have to find our way to new ways, new manners of devotion, where people actually try to be somewhat adequate to what they're entrusted with, and where they stop condescending to the possible public. I think a lot of the problem with contemporary religion is that a lot of the people who run the institutions of religion agree that people aren't too bright, and that if you start saying anything complex to them, that they will, run out the door. It's a robbery, culturally speaking. And any major religion is just a trove of beautiful thought. And it's a terrible thing. We've thrown away many valuable things in this impulse to be modern. And what is modern? It's whatever we make it. It's the unrealized future. We don't have to discard everything that seems to us to be, difficult, really. People love difficulty. The whole history of the world is the fact that people never take anything simple for granted. They always look for some level of, enhancement, refinement, extension, and so on. And that's the history of religion, you know? I mean, it's a long way from St. Augustine to Moby Dick, but, you know, it's not a broken line. That's really how I feel. We have to educate each other better, not just in schools, but in good faith institutional relationships with one another, you know? Give a good sermon, everybody knows what that means.
So, in a sense, you're painting a picture of a failure of leadership. I suppose partly through fear, partly through ignorance, partly through laziness, partly through just a lack of desire to occasionally confront church leadership and leaders have vacated the field, if you like, not sought to be true to that which is good and noble, and in so doing, recognizing the importance of the individual and their intelligence. In a way, perhaps they've insulted people by thinking they can't understand the big issues, the big truths.
I feel that they have insulted people. And, you know, if you look at, I mean, people celebrate religion by the creation of beautiful things, beautiful experiences, mosques and temples and all of them, you know. It could come experience the idea of the eternal, you know. The loss of that impulse, I think, has done a great deal to impoverish people's experience, and also the layer of civilization that we will leave as opposed to the one that we inherited.
And now, one of the great sadnesses to me is that having just made those criticisms, there are many wonderful people out there, many, there really are, who have remained true, who are out there working with the most disadvantaged, that are out there engaging people, are true to the nobility of the scriptures and the idea of the sanctity of the individual. And they're decried when, in fact, they're the people that are showing us the way to go if we'd only stop and listen. We've created that vacuum of leadership has had a double-barreled effect. It's played to our worst instincts, and now we have difficulty often recognizing truth and beauty when we see it.
That's very true, very true. And you know, I realize when I criticize religion or religious institutions that I'm slighting people who in many instances are much better people than I am, you know, much purer Christians than I am. Nevertheless, you simply, I mean, I've worked with very well-educated graduate students for years, and I know what they didn't know, and I know what they wanted to know, you know? And if they can come through that much experience without having a, a really secure sense of what it is that we should value, you know, out of what comes beauty or you know, a higher sense of what is to be wanted in life or whatever. Um, if they seem at a loss in those ways, then I can only imagine how people less advantageously placed experience these things, you know. People are generous if you don't interfere. I think many people want to be large-spirited people, you know. They want to have a wholesome, you know, respectful relationship with other people. But there are these counter narratives, these sort of mammonism, Baal worship, and so on, that come into the civilization and seem overwhelming at times. You know, the worship of wealth, for example, or the definition of success. You know, as accumulating a lot of stuff. I mean, it's satirized so many times, it's hard to believe that that criticism should still be available. And it makes people cynical. They know they don't want these kinds of things ahead of time, but they're not given a way to deeply enjoy themselves as sacred human beings with insights that are astonishingly profound and beautiful, you know, if they simply trust themselves to discipline their thinking and so on toward things that they can value.
People listening to this, many might be thinking, oh, really? The Bible is so obtuse, it's so difficult to read, it seems full of, it's a common criticism now that it's bloodthirsty and all the rest of it, which reflects pretty superficial readings, I think, of what it's really saying about the way we treat one another and its causes. But plainly, you are saying we'd do well to read the Bible again. What would you say to people listening to this who think that's arcane and difficult and inaccessible? Why should I try?
Well, it's the old fascination of Western civilization. If you go through the history of the emergence of the text and the various languages and so on, and real arguments about how to interpret a certain word or something, and um, it's been a problem. It's a problematic text. It always has been a problem, but the deepest understanding of it is an extraordinary elevation of the understanding of what is humanly possible or what is ultimately possible, metaphysically, say, If you read Exodus, I'm writing about Exodus right now, or Deuteronomy is a better example, but it lays out, forgiveness of debts, special attention to people who are vulnerable, widows and orphans and so on. The fact that you have to put aside your crops, or you have to let people walk through your fields and pick what they need, all this sort of thing. You have to every 7 years even let the wild animals wander, through your fields and so on. It you know it, God says in Deuteronomy, if you follow my laws, there will be no poor among you. In other words, it's set up as a distributive system. We don't, and then the whole thing melts away again every 50 years. All property is restored to the tribes that are the original owners. So it's a very good system for preventing concentration of wealth, for prohibiting a kind of closed-fistedness that would make poverty a permanent condition, in the fact that people are so harmed by it that they have no possibility of recovering, you know. Um, it's a brilliant system that probably nobody ever, I mean, Joshua and Judges doesn't suggest that they ever really tried it out very effectively, but what you can see in principle is that God intends the wealth of the world to be continuously redistributed, debts to be continuously forgiven, and so on. And if I don't have any question really that if that were how we proceeded, we would be in vastly better shape, I mean, as cultures and as human beings.
Well, of course,
And
you could argue, and I would argue, that
yes,
at the higher points of Western civilization, we have developed systems that seek to lift people out of marginalization and out of poverty. And the global effort after the Second World War, largely driven, I think, I have to say, by your country, but also more broadly by the Allies, to try and build economic prosperity and opportunity in shattered lands and in poor lands, has been quite remarkable. And I would say that has been the influence of the Bible, but it's all dissipating away now as we essentially substitute the idea of a greater God for the idea that I am God over my life and it's all about me.
mhm. Yes,
I'm not
it's
saying
true.
we've got it perfect, not far from it, but I think we were making better progress in an age when we were more respectful of a higher authority and perhaps less obsessed with self.
Yes, I think that's true. I saw an article once by a woman, I assume a young woman, who was talking about the fact that in reformist literature in the early 20th century and so on, they would often say that they were looking to the needs of the widow and the orphan. And she did not recognize that as biblical language, so she didn't
Yeah.
know what was being alluded to. And she thought that these reforms were intended only for widows and orphans. I mean, that's what's happened. We've forgotten the language. We've forgotten what
Yes.
burdens of meaning it carried.
Now, it seems to me that one thing that is happening that's positive is that there's something of a revival of appreciation for Christianity amongst those that we might call cultural elites. I wouldn't say it was terribly widespread yet or very deep, but it's significant. If the new atheism isn't dead, at last it has some competition. Do you see a comeback for Christianity in these ages when people are starting to ask big questions about where we're going? They're very uneasy. They're very uncomfortable. We seem to be threatened on many fronts.
Well, I think the first thing I would have to say is God knows. I mean, you know, having the ability to comprehend what is at stake in Christianity is a gift of God, I think, um, that, a lot of people who consider themselves Christians have simply signed up as they would into any organization, and felt as if they are guaranteed special treatment by God by virtue of having been in a particular pew on a Sunday, Um, and, this is an obstacle, as far as I'm concerned, to the real emergence of Christianity, which I think would have to take a strong, perhaps radical form, just in order to reinstill the idea that this is not just some sort of, covenant to create personal piety and respectability in oneself, but is an absolute claim on people to understand the holiness of existence and certainly of their fellow creatures. The whole Bible is simply the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. There is nothing excluded from holiness in that sense. And I know my dear old John Calvin in his gloss on "Thou shalt not steal," he says, if you deprive people of respect they deserve, you have stolen from them. You know, if you fail to acknowledge their human dignity in any way, you have stolen from them because that is their right. That is. Um, I think that's a profoundly strong insight, um, and it's something that uh, you have to recover the whole sense, I think, of Christianity in order to see that, yes, that's obviously true, you know, that people are beloved and endowed and all this sort of thing, and you can't treat them otherwise without depriving them of what is their own, their inalienable rights, as Thomas Jefferson would say.
It does seem to me that we're living now in a very visual and auditory age, also an age of declining literature and attention spans. The evidence is pretty clear on that. AI is also increasingly doing a lot of our writing. I mean, it really is quite astonishing now, the sort of writing that AI can do. Perhaps it's even starting to do some of our thinking for us. You're a great lover of literature and you see its value. How does it fit in an age increasingly outsourcing reasoning and even creativity to technology?
Well, you've seen what a struggle I have with technology in its simplest forms, but nevertheless, there's a certain, I mean, specific people and specific sources go into AI. It macerates, all kinds of stuff from the internet, all kinds of any kind of unprotected literature, any language that it can get its hands on basically goes into this sort of paper mache uh, deconstruction, reconstruction of language. Um, and that's not where you would find the best thinking. That's not where you would find some objective, wise other that will supervise our lives for us. Pornographic uh, publications, everything goes into this. Um, and I mean, it's clever. It's kind of a tribute to language that it can be linked together into something that's meaningful on the basis of quite arbitrary signals. But actual intelligence or actual moral seriousness or those things, they're rare. They're certain to be missed. The experiences that create profundity in thought, like isolation, perhaps disappointment or fear, or God knows what other things have gone into poetry and philosophy and so on. It can't have that range of experience, And to the extent that it captures it by simply stirring it in with all the other language it can capture, it's so underrepresented, so atypical, that I can't imagine it sustaining itself in that milieu.
Yeah, what your prolific writing, and I don't know how you do it. I've got just a couple of your books here: The Givenness of Things, What Are We Doing Here, essays. What comes through all the time is this profound belief, you just alluded to it again, that there are no ordinary people. And I really resonate with that. One of the things I learned is in 2 decades as a federal member of parliament in this country is that you would find people that the world might regard as having no particular education, no particular status, but they would say things or have perspectives that made you realise just how unique and special they were. And that's plainly your view as well. You seem to capture this idea that every person's a civilization of ideas and experiences. Is this inherently and fascinating nature of every individual something that you've always had a sense of? Where's its genesis, so to speak?
I think it kind of came from growing up in small towns in the mountain states just south of Canada, in these little towns that were lumber towns, basically, and I was, I had a brother that was very intellectually precocious, and it was always bringing me, the complete dialogues of Plato or something that I would read into my, pre-adolescent consciousness, And I had these two worlds at the same time, the sense of a great ancient other world, and then the sense of my own extraordinarily sort of circumscribed experience. My family's been living there. They are no longer, but I would have been the 4th generation in my family to live in that county, say, and I wanted to be able to, I needed to believe in the equal importance of the lives I saw and was surrounded by, with, Plato and Sophocles and so on, and the people at my brother's university, It was a metaphysical problem. I didn't want to feel that I was having a diminished version of life. And as you say, if you're attentive to people, if you pay attention to what's going on around you, you find out that these expectations that we have that people will be limited and so on are not true. They just dull your perceptions.
Conversely, I'd have to say that many of the people I've seen in elite positions are themselves very limited.
Absolutely. I hate that word. I hate the word.
It does seem to me that in part what you're saying, and I think it's absolutely gold, is that capturing the inherently complex nature of individual people is not only fascinating, it's the key to great literature, to great fiction, isn't it? And perhaps part of the problem is that, as you've said, we've lost the language by which we can understand the complexities of life and the extraordinary, unique nature of every individual.
Yes, I think that's very true. I have to agree with you. People who subscribe to the idea elite have made a qualitative distinction between themselves and the non-elite, which is a mistake. It is not, as you said, people can be beautifully articulate in a non-educated dialect, what this country does, and what I will do until I expire, is basically trust people in general to somehow or other be competent to make very large decisions, they've done very well, I think, over time. I'm worried about them now, but I'm not going to, it's been a sort of a primary faith of my life. I'm not going to give it up simply because we're having an anomalous experience at the moment.
How do we understand our deep longing, on the one hand, that hasn't gone away, even in this age that we're describing, for personal and genuinely meaningful relationships with others on the one hand, and yet this sort of powerful impulse that we're seeing to depersonalize and to instrumentalize, if you like, even commodify the lives around us for our own ends? How do we reconcile those two? Because one is so destructive, the other is so rich.
It is strange. People are very docile in face of what is called the future, And it's like with AI, I've talked with people about that. They say, well, people worried about the horse and buggy, And you think, well, if they'd if they'd had a good long look at what would come of the internal combustion engine, maybe they would feel more justified in in being loyal to the horse and buggy, But very few people describe the future. It's like with the Manhattan Project, which was very secret. Nobody knew that was going on until the bombs fell. And with AI, very few people seem to have any real grasp of what that is, but they're continuously told that it is the future, And enormous amounts of capital are being dumped into it all the time, which means that a great many people have a vested interest in saying, yes, it is the future, whether they know what it is or not, I think that we don't, I mean, journalists tend to be vulnerable to the same mistakes that the general population is, as much cowed by the word futurity and so on, I don't think we had to come the way we have come. I think we've made science fiction movies for generations that have told us, this is not the world that we want to make, and still we make it that world, everything machines and the objectification of human beings and so on. We act as if we don't have choices. We really act as if we don't have choices. People really self-subordinate. And, they talk about, like, with AI, they could put hundreds of millions of people out of work, and then, nobody seems to have any idea of what would happen if that were to be true. And yet that's the future, so we're all supposed to march into this, into this maw, I think it's just a very sad thing. I don't know why we can't muster any resources at all in opposition to these very dubious ideas. And the use that AI makes of water and electricity and so on, they're even talking about restarting discredited old nuclear plants. And for what? For something that nobody knows except it's the future.
Scratch me and I'll say that the thing that I find depressing about AI is this. There's a view in security and military circles that we absolutely have to win the AI race, because if we don't, it'll become so powerful to military ends that bad actors will have even greater influence over affairs than bad actors with nuclear weapons or biological weapons. That is a terrifying aspect of it, that if we lose that race and bad actors win it, none of us will be safe. It's sad that it's come to that, but there's an element of truth in that thinking, I'm afraid.
Yes, and yet if we had not been so full of fear and so insistent on being fearful for the last 80 years, we would not have these amazingly sophisticated weapons to terrify ourselves with. I mean, the fact is, the Russians are very good at all kinds of things. We're very good at all kinds of things. We have created everything as a contest between us, who can make the most terrifying weapons, stimulated in both cases by the fact that the other side is very good at this sort of thing. Fear has been the fuel behind the development of the terrifying, antagonisms far beyond anything that human beings have ever dealt in before. And I mean, just the fear of the nuclear event uh, has made everything seem possible. I I I was worried about AI, and then I saw this article about how we have to compete with China. We're in a race with China. As soon as anybody tells this country that they're in a race with somebody, they go completely out of their minds to win this race, or to at least be able to allow themselves to believe they're somewhere near, winning. And it drives things to extremes. I have no idea what, if it weren't for the Iron Curtain speech and things like that, if we could have ever normalized relations with Russia after the Second World War, I don't think we'd have so many things to be afraid of. But fear,
Nonetheless, I'm sure you
rationale.
agree that democracy well-founded and a virtuous people using it wisely is certainly preferable to the authoritarian approaches of other systems. And in 2020, you wrote something that I loved. You wrote in a New York Times opinion piece, I gather it was very widely read, that, quote, democracy is the great instrument of human advancement. We have no right to fail it. That really resonated with me because I've been thinking a lot lately about the way in which, look, we should always learn from the mistakes we've made. I'm not arguing that we've been perfect at all. Nonetheless, most of us in the West live lives that are much longer and more opportunity laden than the short British lives of most people down through the ages. We have much to be thankful for. And I think we demean ourselves as well as, if you like, rob other people of the dignity that they're worth when we decry those who've gone before us, on whose shoulders we stand. Often we're relative pygmies, I know I am, compared to the people who have made enormous sacrifices to give us the freedoms we've made. Surely democracy, we need to reignite an awareness of people of how important it is and what's needed in terms of personal virtue and commitment and duty, if you like, to make it work.
Well, I think whatever you say is true. I mean, as I said before, there's nothing I value above democracy, But it was not, the Manhattan Project was not pursued in a democratic manner, too much secrecy around it. AI is not pursued in a democratic manner. The enormous cultural changes are being made uh, without anyone giving a meaningful rationalization to the public at large about what this, what this will lead to in terms of their own future and so on. I mean, you can't have a democracy if people are voting blind. Nobody knew what the Manhattan Project was. I mean, Americans didn't know until the Japanese knew what the Manhattan Project consisted in. I think that it would not be hard to make the case that a democratic, referendum on the subject would never have dropped that bomb, you know? So it's not anything against democracy. It's the fact that democracy can be bypassed.
I understand that. Can I just throw you a dilemma that I would grapple with in that situation? We know that the Germans were desperately trying to develop a nuclear weapon, and the world would be much less safe for democracy, to put it crudely, had they got there first. We also now know that the Japanese were as well, astonishingly. So we can, if you like, beat up on ourselves, but we need to be realistic and recognize that in a fallen world, our opponents were trying, if I can use that generally, our opponents during the Second World War were desperately trying to win that race as well. And if they'd done so, it would have been a pretty different world that we live in.
Yes, Werner Heisenberg, I think, was the director of the German development program, and I think he was nowhere near designing a workable bomb. I mean, he seems actually not to have been terribly sympathetic to the project. Well, I won't say give the devil his due. I don't know the man, but But I think that I mean, there weren't enough weapons of any kind, of that kind, to win a war even in 1945, you know. They were singular events that were, you know, effective in destroying isolated cities. But it took a lot of time and a lot of technique to build one bomb. I mean, what I'm saying is that if the Germans had gotten the bomb, we might still have won the war. It's not to say we would not have.
Nonetheless, I mean, my real point is that part of the difficulty is people who act without virtue, and we're a little inclined to think that we monopolize that. In reality, human beings are capable of gross evil of all sorts in every culture. And, you know, it was just striking to me to discover that the Japanese were working on one. And does anybody doubt that they would have used it if they developed it?
Well, I mean, that's one of those things that history will not answer for us. I wouldn't be surprised if they would. But the thing is, I mean, we're a much less vulnerable target than an island chain, you know. I mean, we've got major cities thousands of miles apart from each other and so on, you know. But in any case, I'm not saying anything negative about people in general. I don't think they would have approved Manhattan Project if they'd known about it, and I doubt that they would approve AI if they were aware of it in any meaningful way. They're simply being told to resign themselves.
Well, they're big issues, aren't they? And in the end, I think what you're striking at in your recognition of, you know, the sanctity of the individual is that it's important, particularly in a democracy, if it's to function properly, that people exercise virtue and a sense of duty. And that has been decried in recent times in the name of seeking self-satisfaction, the sort of supercharging of radical individualism.
Yes, but you know, I think that radical individualism very quickly becomes very empty and boring.
Yes.
I mean, you know, how many yachts can you have, or how many yachts is it meaningful to have, you know, this sort of thing. This plutocratic class we have generated lately has no imagination, no aesthetic sense, you know. They just keep doing a few little things over and over again, you know, and maybe getting themselves in trouble with the law or something because they out of boredom, I suppose, you know. I think that it's becoming very clear how hollow an aspiration that worldview is allowing to its, you know, subjects. And you know, if the people who have the keys to the trove or the library of humane history and art were more determined to make the beauty of it available, you know, that there could be a recoil against this terrible subservience to money and you know, other people's very dubious ideas that get put into effect without anyone having a chance to discuss them in the public forum.
In its crudest, if it were money and wealth and material things that made us happy, we'd be the happiest people that ever walked the surface of the earth. And yet all the raw
Exactly.
statistics tell you we are anything but.
Exactly.
I find it very sad that so much that depression, anxiety, self-harm, these things are so common now in so much of the Western world.
It's really true. And that, you know, another thing besides the subservience to the idea of the future, there is also the fact that we assume decline. You know, it's like we've all read Gibbon 100 times or something, like that. If you see something bad, a bad tendency in society or something, it will only multiply. You know, it will only spread through the whole body and all the rest of it. You know, metastasize. That doesn't need to be true. There's no reason for us to give ourselves over to decline any more than to someone else's idea of, you know, a maximally organized society.
Interestingly, I think I'm right in saying that you've described America as a dysfunctional family. It's a term we hear quite a bit. Sounds terrible until you realize that a dysfunctional family is still a lot better than a whole lot of warring tribes. I think. So
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just interested in you perhaps telling us a little of your thinking there. What might America do and what sort of leadership might be needed to, help it become a more functional family again, as America really has been at its high points in the last couple of centuries. A great force for good.
Yes, well, it needs to hear exactly that much more often than it does. I mean, a lot of this sort of number one business and so on uh, is just utterly vacant, and no specifics, like where we number one when we delivered food into Belgium after the First World War, yes, by many measures, I think you could say that was a high point, but people don't talk about those things. They assume that you mean something kind of militaristic, although they're not specific about that either, um, it's a it's a kind of an antagonism that seems basically bent against other Americans, specifically ones that at the moment are associated with, you know, universities and I mean and journalism and so on. That's Trump. But we have to be able to, I mean, like no family is held together by the worst accusations its members make of against one another, Um, I, there is the fact, the indisputable fact, which we have basically in common with the Western world, that there was slavery, that it was looting of the populations of Africa, uh, a terrible thing, that happened in Brazil and the Caribbean and Australia, and I mean, uh, although actually the sort of people that were uh, exploited in Australia were white, I guess, Irish probably. But in any case, all this is true, and it's shameful that it was such a labor to bring ourselves to the point of actually acknowledging it. There was an effort that way after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, and then that just somehow sank out of sight. Uh, and the idea seems to have been that we seem to exclude the Black population from visibility in our history or in our present time. And it's amazing because if you see them emerging now, what a brilliant population, what amazing things Black people have done in the last 50 years, um, after centuries of just suppression. And what, that has to be looked at, that has to be acknowledged. And it's painful. But if we're going to make a family, it has to include everybody in the room,
We
And
need to celebrate our heroes as well, surely.
oh
I,
yes,
it's one of the things that we've done is we've de-statued, if you like, some people who might have had dubious pasts. But the reality is that we've also either ignored or de-statued many people who have, well, everyone has their limitations. They might have been victims of some of the biases of their times and so forth, but have striven to build a better world. I do think we demean ourselves when
I
we
agree.
either ignore those who have gone before us or demonize them unfairly, particularly when we've not, many of the people who make those accusations, who are so judgmental about those who have gone before them, have contributed nothing and show no signs of contributing anything to a better world.
Yes, yes, I agree. I mean, I certainly feel very strongly that, well, America has gone through a kind of depressive period, and I think that it's related to authentic history that had to be confronted, and that which was very painful on one hand, and then on the other hand, a sort of mob psychology that bears some similarity to the actual recovery of lost history, but in fact it's just the projection backward of cynicism and self-righteousness.
Mm.
These things have mingled together. Uh, I think that things that are really worth respect, everything associated with the reform of racial relations and so on, has been discredited just opportunistically because it resembles cynicism and rejection and, uh, I don't know, and devaluing the good work that people have certainly
Yes.
done.
We need heroes. All of us need heroes. And, for a Christian, the ultimate hero is the God-man Jesus, the ultimate hero, I would have thought. It takes us out of ourselves into an infinitely bigger world, and our real identity is found there rather than looking inward, it seems to me. Can I just, as we land this plane, so to speak, bring it into the strip, can I ask you, several people I've talked to in recent times from your country have been talking about the rise of classical education, attempts to do better with inculcating an understanding of the past and of all that is good and noble in young people. And then there's the rejection, I suppose, of what's happening in a lot of the education system by those who choose to homeschool. What are your thoughts in relation to young Americans? Are they, being sufficiently inducted into their own tradition of literary imagination and, if you like, bigger thinking and so forth that arises from it?
Well, I think that they're quite impoverished in terms of, well, the kind of education that I had, where you read Cicero because Rome was also a republic, and you know what I mean. That the idea that what we were and what we were doing had this very deep historical root, with a little trouble getting through the Middle Ages, but basically, and that's a wonderful scale at which to look at things, but for our purposes, and I'm very much a classicist myself, but for our purposes, we have to, uh, uh, be faithful to the fact that Western culture is not everybody's culture in our country, and that. Even though, frankly, I find it very characteristic that people from Asia or whatever are interested in the classic tradition, but it's an anxiety about the fact that we don't want to again make an exclusionist history. And that's a generous impulse and a difficult one to act out. And I wish that the value of old and ancient literature and philosophy and so on were brought to people's attention. I'm very interested in history, but what I'm interested in is the fact that when you look back to the great figures, John Wycliffe or, whoever, you find, yes, here was a living man working in conditions of extraordinary difficulty. You find that over and over again in that period, actually. Making a beautiful appreciation of a sacred text, And this is simply objectively a wonderful thing. And one more thing that you know about human beings and human potential and what we have around us that we can appreciate for the depths of its roots in history. I think that it's like there's a product that we don't want to sell, we don't want people to buy apples, we want them to buy chewing gum, you know what I mean? And so there's a sort of who would want an apple, you know what there's a kind of rejection of something as if it were terminally out of style, in favor of something much more easily absorbed. And that energy is a progressive impoverishment. But the thing about it is, the thing that has to be said is that all of these people with devoted lives that influenced history to such an extent, almost all of them had the impulse to write. And their books are around, they are among us, And if we want to follow out a scrupulous, devout, intentional mind, we can probably find his book, her book, So we don't, we're not just losing and forgetting, because we're also amazing archivists.
Yes.
And if you look far enough, you can find anything. And you can find out how beautiful Piers Plowman was and is, and so on.
Interesting, isn't it, that you just mentioned John Wycliffe? My understanding is that when Americans, probably many people in the world, think of democracy, they think of Abraham Lincoln, government of the people, by the people, for the people. My understanding is that he heard it in a sermon shortly before he gave that famous address. And the sermon actually was drawing on the work of John Wycliffe from many centuries earlier.
That has made me very happy. I love John Wycliffe. I mean, truly. That's great. Yes, apparently it was often inscribed in editions of the Geneva Bible also, which I assume Lincoln would have had.
Interesting.
But,
It
yeah.
just points to what you're saying, doesn't it? The importance of historical understanding and the language to comprehend where ideas come from, good ideas and bad ideas for that matter.
Yes, yes. And, it's a way of, in the same way that you try to extend respect to the human beings around you, you try to extend it to people who lived before you, even if they lived in the year, 500 BCE, and the Bible actually does that. I mean, the Psalms are so wonderful about this introspective self and so on.
I just want to ask you, so in view of all of this, are you feeling cautiously optimistic or cautiously pessimistic about America's future?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that's fair to say, because I believe in the basic goodness of the American person, not to the exclusion of other people. But what I fear most from Trump is that he will do things that are clearly disgraceful and inhumane. For example, his treatment of immigrants, But I think that if he does step over that boundary, the public will react. People, as a matter of day-to-day life, people are not upset about immigration. We've always had immigration, I don't know why I don't understand him. Either he's a devil or he's brilliant or something, but he seems to know how to arouse excitement in crowds by saying things that those individual people would never take on as an idea of their own. So I mean, we're in the hands of God. We're in the hands of the American public when it comes down to it. So I have to be optimistic.
Well, that is democracy in action, and I've thought about this quite a bit. It does seem to me that many Americans must have been deeply torn, but enough in the middle decided that they wanted to exercise the judgment that resulted in Trump becoming the president. So this will be, if you like, a test of democracy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I hope we meet in person one day.
Yes, I would love that.
Thank you so much.